welcome to another spontaneous auto dialogue. I'm Yazad at the Center for Civil Society, and with me today is an old friend, Anupam Manur of Takshshila Institution in Bangalore. And we are in this wonderful city of Bangalore to discuss the issue of jobs in India. Yeah. So, Anupam, tell us a little bit more about yourself and on Takshshila.
Okay, I'll start with Takshshila. It's think tank, policy think tank, and a school of public policy. So, as a think tank, we do research and put it out in the public domain. Our areas of research is geopolitics and foreign policy, international relations as one bucket. The second bucket would be on economic policy, and the third one is on technology policy. So these are the three broad areas of research that we do. And as a school of public policy, we run various programs from a 48-week, 1-year master's level program to shorter duration 3-month courses on public policy. And public policy, there's defense and foreign affairs, and finally on technology policy. So that's the range of courses we run. And what I do there is actually a bit of everything. So I obviously do research in various parts. Jobs is one of them that I worked on. Apart from that, right now I'm working on India's energy security needs and so on. And as part of the policy school, I teach economics in pretty much all of our courses. I teach something called strategic economics for the people who are interested in defense. I teach something called information economics for people who are interested in technology policy. So that's the teaching role of it. And of course, like everyone else in Takshshila, we write, we come on videos, and we do podcasts and things like that. So
Wonderful. So, uh, one of the things that has been worrying me, and I'm sure has been worrying you a lot as well, has been the state of the Indian economy.
yeah.
Uh, where is it right now? If you could draw a picture of where the Indian economy stands, and I mean, our growth rate is some abysmal 4 point some percent.
4.5%. Yeah. So I think, right at the beginning of all of this, I think we should put a disclaimer to this episode is necessarily going to be bleak. There's not a lot of happy news around. So I think it's good to kind of bracket that right at the beginning. Yeah, I don't think the economy is doing very well. It is growing at 4.5% from, let's say, the heady days of in the early 2000s when we used to grow at 9-10%. Now it's come down to almost a trickle, which is 4.5%. Some of it is, yes, global in nature. You've had a situation where I think overall global growth is slowing. You've got trade war, which doesn't really augur well, and you've got right now something like the coronavirus and so on. But I mean that effect is yet to be seen. But all of these are not really good news. But just on its own, I think Indian economy has come to a kind of standstill. The effects of the liberalization that we did in 1991 has it's tapered off. We've not done enough reforms since then to kind of again get back to a high trajectory of growth. And of course, don't want to put too fine a point on this, but we've also shot ourselves in the foot. Through demonetization, a botched up GST and so on, and this is those were own goals which were completely unwarranted. So that's largely the state of the Indian economy. I mean, we can pick various factors, jobs, of course, as we'll spend a lot more time on, so I'll leave that for now. But if you look at, for example, exports was at a 45-month low in September last year. If you look at, for example, how well we're doing in terms of investment rate, it's fallen from something like 39% to about 29%, a 10 percentage point drop in the last decade. Our savings rate has been falling continuously. You look at any such macroeconomic indicator, I mean, one of the things that was actually good in the last 5-6 years was the fact that inflation was very low. CPI inflation was about 2, 3, 4%, well within RBI's comfort range, but wholesale inflation was in fact negative. That's a very strange situation for India. And now, in fact, that unfortunately is also reversing. Now CPI inflation has gone up to about 7.5%, which is again not really good news. In a situation of stagflation, of
Exactly.
high, yeah.
I was going to say, shall we use that dreaded word?
I
You
think
already
we can.
did.
We definitely can, because growth falling from something like 7.58% to about 4.5%, and inflation increasing from something like 3 to 7% is definitely, I think, at least on the periphery of this phenomena called stagflation.
Because our growth is lower than our inflation right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in a sense, it's negative.
Yeah. So that, I think, is the kind of problematic areas with the economy. And even within this, for people who are following the news today and yesterday, on the verge of a financial crisis as well, with Yes Bank going under, or at least thereabouts. I don't want to create further panic, but it's at least, things are not all rosy there. So these, I think, just to give you a very broad kind of picture of the Indian economy.
So the picture is bleak.
It's bleak, yeah. I mean, you look at, for example, one of the things that we've always been relying on as a engine of growth in India is consumption, right? We keep stressing that there's
we're a consumption economy.
Yeah, we're 1.3 billion people. These people require goods and services, and therefore that by itself should, kind of propel the economy forward. But if you look at figures there as well, it's not really, interesting in the sense that the FMCG goods consumption rate has fallen. Right, sales have fallen, auto sales have fallen drastically, to the extent that Bajaj, I mean, generally even scooters and two-wheelers and three-wheelers and tractors and cars and lorries, all of them have fallen across the board, and all of that, I think, tells you that the economy is not doing as well. And finally, and sorry for anyone's sensitivity, but people are not even buying enough innerwear. Right, the falls of that has gone. I mean, the sales of that has gone down, which tells you that things are not really good. Right, if people are postponing toothbrush, toothpaste, and innerwear, then that tells you that people do not have enough disposable income.
So why don't people have disposable income? Is it because they don't have jobs? Is it because employment is down?
I think that obviously becomes a really big part of all of this. Jobs. The only way to earn income is through employment. I mean, apart from social security net, which we do not really have. So if employment is down, then obviously income is down. But it also is to do with this overall kind of slowdown of the economy, right? So people who even have an income, that income is not high enough. It is slowing. It is also, there's uncertainty in people's mind. So even if someone has, for example, a salary, they're not sure for how long will they have that salary, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty, there's volatility in income. So all of these, I think, adds up to this present crisis.
And we keep talking about jobs, but we don't really talk about what's an ideal kind of job, or, because the Prime Minister once talked about pakoda walas. Right. So we have to take that also into account.
Right. I think we've spent far too much time as both academicians and as society wondering and debating about this formal versus informal sector and so on. Whereas I do not think that is of prime. I mean, the labeling is not really that important now, because with, for example, the growth of the gig economy, where do you put that? It's not formal, it's not informal, it's somewhere in between. It's contractual in many senses. So I think you really have to look at the jobs thing from two perspectives, right? One is how much income are they getting? Right. Yes. And the second axis on which you would look at is how consistent is that income. So vulnerability in that sense. So if it is extremely volatile, then your vulnerability goes up. So you could earn a lot today, but then nothing tomorrow. That's not ideal scenario.
That's the classic gig economy in that sense.
So if you kind of adjust for these two factors, level of income and then volatility of income, you have a better kind of classification of jobs rather than formal versus informal. Because someone can be in the informal sector. I mean, look at a freelancer who works and writes high-level code. Technically, that person is an informal sector employee. And then if you try and do policies for that person as against, let's say, a construction worker or a pakoda seller, it's two entirely different universes. So I think that is why we should not get carried away by this formal versus informal, rather look at it on these two axes.
So this amount of income and vulnerability of income is a very interesting concept that I haven't really heard before, except with Takshshila. So what kind of analysis or what kind of inferences do you get from that?
So I think that should, one, we move away from the formal informal debate, because remember that there is multiple classifications there. You can be a formal worker in an unorganized sector. No, that not really, but you can be an informal worker in an organized sector. So you bring in this, whether the industry is organized, unorganized, and then whether the person is formal, informal, and so on. I think that just leads you through different kinds of rabbit holes, which will not yield the kind of outcomes that you want to do. But instead, I think it's far better to look at these two axes, and then ultimately, then there's very clear policy indications. You want to try and push people's incomes up, and you want to push the stability up. So
Correct.
you know which trajectory you want to push people. So policy making, I think, becomes a lot more straightforward. And
So it's not just moving incomes up. It's
Yeah.
also making sure that that income that's moved up has a certain stability to it,
right,
has a certain
Yeah.
amount of predictability to it.
Yes. So which means, for example, this is where the role of something like a pension scheme would come in. So pension scheme for people who are not employed in the formal sector, right? So just having more options such as that can be a perfectly valid policy move.
That's an interesting one, because that also actually talks about social security net.
Yeah.
And you know what happens if people lose a job.
Yeah.
And in what way can they be supported till they get the next job?
Right.
And how does that actually work out, and who pays for that pension?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, these are very interesting kind of things. But I think given the kind of employment jobs crisis, again, I'm using that word deliberately here, given the kind of jobs crisis that we find ourselves in, the questions and issues surrounding social security and things like unemployment insurance is a second order problem. Right now, we just need to be creating jobs and lots of them.
So how do we do that? Because we know the problem is that we've got a 45-year dip in jobs. We've got a lower labor force participation rate. Our female labor force participation rate is what, 16%?
Varying estimates, but yeah, it's about 16 to 22%, which
and
is
it's lower than Saudi Arabia's,
lower than
like
Pakistan,
shocking.
Lower than Saudi Arabia. It's abysmal, or at least in the same league. It doesn't matter if it's a few bips up and down, but it's in the same league.
So we know the problem is dire and bleak. What can we do about it? What policy measures can the government take, or what policy measures by and large do you recommend?
So I think even before getting to the policy measures, broader kind of solutions, the first thing I would actually harp on is, as both the solution as well as defining the problem better, is that we need more transparency and more data in this field. And it is the government's job to give out this data. So I think the first and foremost thing that this government or any other government that comes to power, I think the first responsibility is to make sure that there is enough reliable data. Because if you look at what happened in 2017, 18, and 19, reports from the government's own department, which is Labor Bureau, were suppressed, and they were not allowed to come out in the open, and therefore it muddles the issue anymore. And I don't think we're doing any favors to anyone by hiding some of these facts. I think we should put it out in the open, such that there is a deliberative and a constructive kind of debate and discourse around these issues.
And it should be consistent. It should be on a regular, consistent basis, that every 3 months, like in the United States, where the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out with employment statistics every month,
first Friday of every single month, and that actually moves not just US markets but global markets.
Correct.
Right?
So maybe a month, every month, maybe too ambitious for Indian policymakers.
Every year is definitely doable, and it should be on the cards.
I would push you further and say every quarter. Let's definitely have knowledgeable statistics coming out on a consistent and reliable basis. So it should be predictable. Because the Central Statistical Organization's director resigned because the report was suppressed.
Exactly.
And then you had journalists like Somnath Jha who kind of dug out the numbers and published them in Business Standard. This shouldn't be an investigative journalism story.
Not at all. This should be completely in the open domain, which is accessible to everyone. And also we should have, so when you speak about consistency, we should also be measuring the same thing.
Yes.
The problem is we have one data source from EPFO that people use to estimate how many jobs are created.
Let me stop you. Let's explain to our viewers what EPFO actually is.
Okay. Go ahead.
That's the Employment Provident Fund Organization. So the Provident Fund that is collected, so people who join the Provident Fund organization, the Provident Fund amount that's paid out, it's the social security net that we have.
So you need a membership. You have to be part of the EPFO, and then thereby they just count number of new members added every month. Or every year at least, and then they say these are the new jobs created, though it's extremely problematic.
It's double counting, right? Because if I leave a job and then I join a job somewhere else, and my EPFO number is a new number, for example, is created, then they're counting that I'm a new person. But it's
so I think that there's a lot of problem, and it also just covers the people, as we said, in the formal sector, right? It doesn't cover anyone else, and then there's all kinds of wild extrapolation done, which is wrong. So just to give you an idea, or the viewers an idea of how terrible the data aspect is just for, I think, the year 2018, the estimates of how many jobs were created in India, the range of those estimates is from minus
I know this.
2 million
Yes.
to plus 14 million. I mean, that's a 16 million range, right? And no, scholar or policymaker should be working on a range of 16 million when it comes to something as essential as jobs. So that's, I think, the first and foremost thing that the government has to do, which is give out reliable, consistent, and frequent data.
Yeah, in the absence of that, we rely on data from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy,
Yes.
a non-profit, which has been doing stellar work. But once again, they are relying on consumer surveys
Exactly.
to get the data.
Exactly. CMI does, I think, a beautiful, stellar job, but it shouldn't be that we are looking for employment statistics only from CMI. I mean, that's, I don't think, is an ideal scenario. So that's the range of jobs we've created, right? And I think everyone who's worth their salt as an economist has completely dismissed that 14 million number.
Yes.
We are, I think, a reliable estimate of what we worked on, for example, is that we're probably, and this is being rather generous, we're probably creating about 1 to 2 million jobs each year. That is how well we're doing. But unfortunately, the required rate, that is the number of jobs
1 million a month,
is 1 million a month. So that tells you, I mean, we need to be creating at least 12 million jobs each year. That's just the number of people who are entering the labor force. And then you add to that the number of farmers, for example, agricultural, hidden unemployment in things like agriculture and secondary, in the primary sector, the number of farmers you need to get out of agriculture and these primary sectors into more reliable jobs, then you're looking at something like 19 million jobs each year. So, I mean, the reason why, for anyone who's interested, I think the productivity of farmers in India is so abysmally low, which means that you basically have 4 or 5 people doing the job of one person. And so that's what you call as disguised employment, right? It's not really employment, but you're disguising it as employment. So if you have to even correct that, and therefore, because you have disguised employment, productivity is low. If you have low productivity, incomes are low, and therefore this entire rural distress. And the only way to deal with the agricultural rural distress is to get people out of agriculture
and to manufacturing,
to other jobs, and manufacturing,
which is what, for example, China did. In 5 years they created 60 million jobs, moved people out of farming, moved people out of the agricultural sector into manufacturing, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why they are the economy they are today.
That's the reason why they could have double-digit GDP growth rate for nearly 30 years consistently, year on year. I mean, that's nothing short of a miracle. Whatever else you could blame China for in terms of individual liberty and so on, I think this is one thing they got right.
Very true.
And it's worth going into. Yeah.
So then we know what the problem is.
Yeah.
We know that we need to collect good data. But what would you look at as being some solutions, some kind of policy measures that the government should take?
Right. So I think you can, I was just before coming here, I was trying to see what are the ways in which you can categorize the solutions, because a problem of this sort, which is, so large, obviously has more than one solution. There's no one magic wand which
Correct.
you can just wave around and solve the problem. So you're looking at a whole range of solutions, and there are different ways that you can target this particular thing. As in, you can target sector by sector. You can say, what do we do in the agricultural sector, what do we do in the manufacturing sector, even within which you can look at industry specific kind of solutions, and then what do you do with exports, etc. That's one way to go about it. The other way, and I thought this would be an interesting kind of new approach towards this, would be, why don't we look at it in terms of how much the government needs to do, what is the level of government intervention, and therefore I think that gives you a better idea. So for example, you could have a classification based on how proactive the government is, right? So that's one set of policy measures. The other could be just that the government is facilitating a few things, but I think the biggest bucket is where the government is just leaving things alone, which is
Correct.
Leave it to the spontaneous order, right? So let's look at these things a bit more in detail. So proactive measures, I think by and large at this moment, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. So proactive measures would be something like expanding NREGA, right?
Yeah.
NREGA by itself, I think, is flawed completely. It has numerous problems. I don't think it really, generates the amount of employment that people think it does, and even the quality of employment. If you look at again that scale, if you look at just jobs, yes, it creates jobs, but then what is the level of income? That's extremely low.
It actually even takes away jobs from similar sectors. There was a study saying that a lot of tea plantations are facing a shortage of workers because those workers are digging ditches in NRGA.
Exactly. And you have this very strange contradiction, which is what I think a lot of people use against you when, people who don't believe that we have a jobs crisis use that against you, saying that how can you have labor shortages on one hand, because yes, it is a known problem. Farmers often get, find it really difficult to hire laborers to work in the plantations or to work on the field, whereas on the other hand we are saying that there's a whole bunch of people who are unemployed. But the reason is because of such distortive policy. So young people who could have otherwise worked on these fields and earned an income and been productive, instead are getting paid for not doing anything at all. Right, nearly nothing, or you dig ditches and fill them up again, the old Keynesian method. And the problem with that is, of course, that you're taking away resources from a productive usage to something completely largely unproductive, and yeah, that's created a whole bunch of distortions in the economy. NREJ, again, with any such policy, it's not that it has no positive effects. Of course it does, but I think the costs of something like NREJ far outweighs the benefits of NREJ. So that's on one side with the more proactive role, and then you have something like Mudra, for example, which is again proactive government role. Again, it really doesn't work because most of the loans are given at I think the average size of the loan is something like 44,000. With 44,000, you can hardly pay yourself, right, for a year. How can you employ someone else? So it's not a really employment generation scheme. I would actually go on to say that there's only two things that proactive government policies which are, I think, important. One is infrastructure. A lot of infrastructure, long term, with huge gestation periods, etc. Infrastructure may not always be taken up by the private sector, and especially when you have a downturn, I think the government can just about give that fillip by creating roads, basic road network, and ports and bridges and so on, which will help in the long run. I think that is one proactive measure that the government can do. But the problem again is that the government finances are in such a terrible state that they can't take up capital expenditure, and they're spending majority of their money on revenue expenditure, right, and then deficit financing, basically. So I think that is a huge problem. Instead, I would say that the best way to get out of a rut is to invest heavily in things that you normally wouldn't invest in, which is right now big infrastructure projects. I would say take that up now. It not only creates jobs, but it gets the economy going. You create confidence in the economy and so on. So that is one real proactive role that they can do. But the other one, all forms of SEZs, etc., do not work. We know that. I mean, they again are distortive in nature. You give tax subsidies, tax holidays, you give some subsidies, but then, for example, one of the proactive roles I do is try and generate employment through MSMEs, right? And they deliberately give a lot of subsidies. They even, in fact, create such huge distortion, saying that entire sectors, entire product ranges
can only be done by
yeah,
small sector industries,
which is ridiculous if you ask me. And then you're providing complete incentives for these firms to stay as small as possible and not really grow, right?
Because if they grow, they actually lose the license or so they have to create. It's another way of the license Raj that we got out of 1991. There are a few questions that came up. Should we take them now, or
sure, before we go into other things?
So you touched upon this. So there's a question that says, wherever I go, every bus stop, train station, public place has some or the other job opening advertised.
Right.
Given that, is the real issue the lack of jobs or their quality?
So as we said, again, if you look at it from a level of income and a stability of income thing, most of those jobs, those flyers which says, work from home, earn 9,000 rupees a month and so on, it's a terrible salary. B, a lot of them tends to be also be scams, of course, but let's not go there. And even then you would have huge amount of positions, people applying for those positions as well. As we know, I mean, for example, if you take a similar salary level, which is 9,000 to 10,000 rupees a month, which is extremely low, by the way. I mean, if you're living in Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore, 10,000 rupees a month, you basically cannot live, or you cannot afford a shelter above your head, right? But even positions with that level of income, which is offered by the government, which basically gives you that stability aspect. We know how it's over applied for. So you've got about whatever 93,000 PhD candidates applying for 10 pune jobs, right? I mean, we've heard all such ridiculous statements, but that tells you that there is obviously excess employment supply, but not enough employment demand. Yeah, so that I think is an important.
So another question that came up. I'll take that and then we'll continue.
Okay.
What was the impact demonetization had on the jobs market?
Oh, it's massive. I think one particular statistic I think stands out for me more than anything else. We kind of touched about women labor force participation rate, but overall labor force participation rate of India is extremely low, right? So labor force participation rate refers to the number of people who are actively searching for a job. So you have something like 900 million people in the country who can work, but only not everyone will be looking for a job. So a lot of people just fall out of the labor force. So in India, standard number is about 480 million people are in the labor force, and now after demonetization, the number of people fell by by about 30 million. So just after demonetization, 30 million people just left the labor force, and that's the reason being that they're not 30 million people just left the labor force. So it came from 480 million to about 450 million, and then gradually over 3 years came back to now the present situation, about 480 million. So that kind of tells you that when there are and why do people quit the labor force is because they just cannot find a job. So they try for, let's say, 5 months, they try for 6 months, you don't get a job, you just stop looking, and then instead try alternative means, either any kind of other alternative means to get a job.
You let's go back to what you were talking about. You were talking about the more proactive, and then
so I would say by and large the proactive measures don't work. One other, apart from the investment in infrastructure that I was talking about, I think the one other proactive method that they can do is try and increase female labor force participation rate. And for that particular aspect, if you have to, let's say, make policies which makes people prefer to hire women and so on, then it's something that can be looked at. But I would still by and large say that proactive measures don't work. And the reason for low female labor force participation rate is slightly beyond the ambit of the government. It's more to, it's a social problem.
It's a social issue, yes.
And so that's, I think, an entirely different can of worms rather than this. So that's the proactive measures. Now, if you want to go into, other more regarding the facilitation kind of solutions. Good way to, I think, facilitate job creation. One of the best ways is, in fact, to create cities. And when I say create cities, again, it's not really go out there and create and then fill people in and so on. But again, you create an environment, you facilitate the development of new cities, right? And part of that, big part of that would be, for example, to ease land acquisition. Right, you ease land acquisition. You can designate, a city like what they've done with Amravati, but that's a failed project. But I think it can be a lot easier than that. You have already a lot of tier 1, tier 2 cities, tier 3 cities. Help them develop a bit more by providing good infrastructure, by providing public goods, so that people come there, businesses are set up. Provide basic things that you're supposed to do. Ensure that there's electricity, not free, but electricity connection, water connection. Do all the things that the government is supposed to do, which is ensure property rights and ensure public good provisions, right? And then make sure that other conditions are correct. And I think cities will develop by and large on its own. Do not curb the growth of cities as we do, because we still believe that India lives in its villages and all such romantic nonsense, which is not true. More than, I think, 60% of India is urbanized, though we fail to see that. More than that, by the way. Some estimates suggest that more than 75% of India is urbanized, but not urbanized enough. The problem is that you have an urban center, but we by and large rule them and govern them as though they're villages. So instead of providing for good sanitation, we're providing MNRJ. Right, that's, I think, the big problem. But if you provide for all of these things, the urban centers will naturally become centers for employment generation. We know that there is enough amount of economic evidence how cities create jobs, right? So you can have cities, by and large, you can have generic cities, and the rate of job creation in cities. So if you look at this one stat, for example, there's the labor force participation rate in the normal economy is about something like 48% in India, whereas and then you look at number of people of those who are employed would be about something like 40%. The same thing in a city would go up by at least 10-15 percentage points. So labor force participation rate in the city would go up to something like 65%. Number of employed would go up to about 57, 58, 60% or so on. So that by itself tells you that cities are engines of growth.
Exactly. So they generate that employment that we're
Yeah.
so looking for.
Yeah.
So, and we see that every time. We see that when people migrate from villages to cities. Why do they do that?
Exactly, in search of jobs, right? So there's agglomeration effects which is there. There's the clustering effect that happens. A whole bunch of theories on urban development which can answer all of these as to why cities create jobs. But I think the important takeaway in all of this is that cities can create jobs, and it's the role of the government to ensure that cities develop by at least the base level is not restricting growth of cities. So and we do that, by the way, actively. For a lot of people who do not know, we actively restrict the growth of cities, thinking that cities are evil, villages are beautiful, and all of that, because ultimately a city will have to come on some land, and those land is traditionally will be qualified as agricultural land, and that you can't sell agricultural land for any kind of industrial purpose or even for commercial purposes, which means that that is the kind of restriction I'm talking about.
That's an important point. Actually loosening the land acquisition laws. Another important reason for cities, I think, is because of the classic Adam Smith division of labor.
Yeah.
So
specialization
right? Works in cities. It doesn't work in villages.
Exactly. You get division of labor, you get specialization. With that, you get more trade, and with more trade, you get more economic activity. More economic activity means more jobs and income and overall happiness. You can then write a fairy tale ending saying, "And thus they lived happily ever after." But yeah, that I think is very important, that we realize the importance of cities as an engine of growth. And so within which I think by and large you can do two things. One, you can just, again, as I said, facilitate by providing public goods and providing basic infrastructure requirements. The other, you can actually be slightly proactive. You can, for example, create cities which are university towns. For example, you can build cities which are hospital centers. We anyway have medical tourism, for example, as a really big both forex earner, employment generator, and so on. We can specialize few cities in some of these, and you can have, of course, industrial corridors, which they've been trying to do, but again getting stuck with land acquisition laws. So I think if they just fix that, make it easy for people to get land, and then they will be the best ones to judge as to what to do with that land. The most productive
that should segue to your third: get out of the way.
Get out of the way. I think that's the biggest thing. I think you can look at reforms in multiple set of things. So I will call this get out of the way, or reform plus fix it, because in some areas I think the amount of damage they've done is so deep that you almost need a proactive measure to fix their own damage, not anything else. For example, and let me start with the big one, which again is in the news, which is the financial sector. I think the amount of damage done in the financial sector is so huge that now just getting out of the way is not enough. You need to actively almost fix it, because the NPA crisis, and I think if you ask me, the number one kind of reason for low job creation right now is that there's a lack of investment. Obviously, because investment creates jobs, and the reason for the lack of investment is because you have a completely broken financial system, right?
Okay.
And so you have a huge NPA crisis on what you call as a twin balance sheet problem. Banks are unwilling to lend, corporates are unwilling to borrow. Where will investment come from, right? If this happens. So I think the big thing is to fix the NPA problem, and there are various ways, one of which, again, part of the getting out of the way is just privatize the banks. Privatize. Yeah, you can keep SBI as your banker's bank, I mean government's bank, but just privatize all of that. All of this merging, etc., will not create the kind of result you want. I think that it's a cowardly, I'm using this word kind of deliberately, it is a cowardly kind of solution. By merging multiple public sector banks, you're technically reducing the number of public sector banks, but all you're doing is just merging them. So you're creating bigger, terrible public sector banks. So I don't think that is a solution. You need to privatize it. You can keep SBI and then privatize it. So if your problem is financial security, there are various ways to deal with financial security, right? Public sector banks don't give you that kind of security. So fix the NPA crisis. I know we don't have probably too much time to go into detail about the NPA crisis and so on. It will be a diversion, but I think fixing the NPA crisis should be on the top of the agenda for solving the investment problem. And then so we have to talk about how do you get the investment rate from 29 to 39%, and
or higher than that,
or higher. At least I'm going back to regressing now. I'm saying I'm happy with what was there at least 10 years back, right? It should have been much better, but I'm saying I'll at least take the situation from about 10 years back.
So that's one. Another thing, that's connected to land acquisition is labor laws.
Labor laws, yeah.
Because when we did a study, I remember there are like 50 or more than 50 labor laws only at the central level,
at the union level.
Yeah, not counting the state labor
laws. Not at all. Yeah. So if you take, I think on an average in any particular state, you would have something like 100 to 120 labor laws operating, and that is a ridiculously high number. So I think just to give you an idea, you have a situation where, for example, you cannot, if you hire more than 100 people, you cannot fire any of them without getting written government permission from the labor ministry, right? Which, I mean, what does that tell you about the incentives that you're creating? If you can't fire people for gross, let's say, incompetence,
you won't hire them.
You won't hire them. So you'd be always wary of hiring people because you can't fire them. And there are a number of such laws, right, in the entire labor. If you look at the entire labor aspect, there's a whole bunch of laws which are extremely restrictive for companies to do business. So you're talking about ease of doing business, etc. The number one thing for ease of doing business would be product market, right? I mean, the factor market, land and labor. I think those are the two things that you have to try and fix. You're looking at, for example, if you look at the distribution of firms and the number of employees they have, they'll have a huge number of firms who have exactly 9 employees. You'll have a huge number of firms who have 19 employees, huge number of firms who have 49 employees, and a huge number of firms with 99 employees. The reason being that at each one of those next benchmarks, a whole bunch of labor laws will kick in. So what they end up doing is that either they will not hire people, or they'll hire them on contractual basis, thereby completely destroying the entire purpose of labor laws, because all of those contractual employees will not get any benefit from the labor laws that exist. So you're creating an environment where you're forcing people to hire in an unorganized sector and unorganized market, and not providing them any benefit whatsoever, though the companies were willing to do that in the first place. So that, I think, is the problem. And I think one way in which this really stands out is that India is a labor abundant country. We know that we have 1.3 billion people, yet most of the firms in India are capital intensive. Any economic theory would have told you that a labor abundant country will go for labor intensive manufacturing, or labor intensive basically sectors and industries. But what we have done uniquely is that a labor intensive, labor abundant country like India has gone for capital intensive modes of production and value creation, right? So you look at a lot of firms. Why is it that we are, for example, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, but software has been one of our only big thing that we've been successful at, and that is a purely capital intensive thing. So that tells you the kind of distortions that exist in our entire economy, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so labor laws, I think, is a no-brainer. Trying and correcting labor laws, they've started it. To be fair, this particular government has started some of these things. For example, they're doing a particular thing called the Code on Wages. They're amalgamating about 10 different laws they had on wages, right? Minimum wage, other kinds of wages, how compensation should be given, when it should be given, all of those into one single kind of unified code on wages. I think that is a very good starting point, but you need to rationalize this a lot more. And I think here is one place where states can take a very active role in doing this. For example, let me go out on a limb and say this. Karnataka, which is now run by a BJP government, and with BJP at the center, at the union, there's no reason why Karnataka can't take the lead and completely ease labor laws. Correct, right? And in fact, I mean, so Rajasthan did that. Rajasthan did that in about 2015-16, if I'm not mistaken. They eased labor laws. They took the initiative and they eased labor laws, and in fact, there's been some positive returns to that. The only problem is they didn't do enough, right? It was just, it was scraping the surface of it. But I think Karnataka can take the lead, just be bold, be proactive, and say, I'm going to ease up labor laws in this country, and then in the state at least, and see how it goes. That's definitely something that you can do.
There's some questions there. So Avinash is asking a simple question: should government create jobs?
By and large, the problem is that as of now, government is the only one that's creating jobs, but it shouldn't. It's not the duty of the government to create jobs. It's not the duty of the government to do any form of business. In fact, it's the duty of the government to ensure that the basic conditions are met such that companies will take over. So if you ensure, as I said, property rights, basic infrastructure, and provision of public goods, company, and make it easy for firms to run businesses, basically get out of the way, let markets function. I think companies are best in figuring out what is good for them and what is not good for them, right? If they, for example, you removed all of these labor laws, I think a lot of companies even now will overnight shift to labor intensive manufacturing because it's far more profitable for them than to buy heavy equipment. The reason why they spend 4x more and buy a heavy equipment instead of hiring 100 people is because they don't want to deal with labor laws. You remove labor laws, they will hire more people. So I think it's not the job of the government to create jobs. It's companies will do that, firms will do that, businesses will do that. That's what they're really good at. The role of the government, I think, is just to play this facilitator role.
And we got a question on labor laws.
Oh, fantastic. Bring it up.
So Sudhanshu says that under consolidation of labor laws, is it just an exercise in merging the laws, or is it an exercise in reforming them, making, removing the old ones?
So I know there's a lot to be done there. I think one of the basic stuff that you have to do is, you can find about, I think you can easily find about 40 labor laws that have no business to exist in 2020. Right? These are laws which were made in 1857. Some of the Industrial Disputes Act, for example, the Factories Act, etc., are from the 1850s. Let that just sink in for people, right? It has no business here. I'll give you one very simple example. There's a law which mandates that any factory which hires more than 20 or 50 people, I'm not really sure on that number, has to have a spittoon placed at whatever equal distances so that
people having pan can spit.
Yes, that is a labor law. Imagine that is mandated by the government.
I remember this.
That is how ridiculous things can get. So you can remove a whole bunch of these things. You can just identify about 30 to 40 different such laws and you can completely remove them. Some of them requires merging because I think one of the big problem in labor laws, if you want me to go slightly deeper into this, if you have the time,
we have time.
Is that a lot of these laws are contradicting in nature. So you have, let's say, a law in the union list itself. You have a law from the Industrial Disputes Act and you have a law from the Factories Act, and both of them will be contradicting each other, right? And then therefore, which one do you follow?
So I remember my friend who used to run restaurants in Bangalore once told me that the fire department requires you to have at least 2 entrances in a restaurant,
entry and exit places, whereas
the excise department wants you to have only one and not more than one. So either which way, you are contradicting one law. You are going against either the fire department or the excise department. You've got to choose whom to pay off.
Exactly. Oh, basically, then you look at what is the rate of the officials, how much bribe you have to give out, and then choose. And so there are multiple such contradictions in the union level laws. Now, to add one extra layer of complication, you have union laws and state laws. Because labor is in the concurrent list, you have union laws and state laws on the same subject, and those will be contradicting. So then which one do you follow? Do you follow the union law or do you follow the state law on this? So there's no way. So I think some of these requires rationalization, and the laws by itself will not be, at least the intention behind those laws would be fairly good, but it's just that they're contradicting and they're not implemented well. So which means you need to completely rationalize it, and then as my standard saying in all of this, right? No one cares about what intention you had. The road to hell is paved with good intention. So no one cares about the intentions. It's about what do you do with it, right? And what are the outcomes? So you got to look at the outcomes and make policy based on that. So you can merge some of these laws, you can completely remove some of them, and you need to, I think, change. Imagine you're still trying to govern the relationship between Uber driver and Uber, right? Which is a completely 2010 odd problem, which is, it's a gig economy. The contractual employees, Uber doesn't even tell them and call them as employees, but they're independent contractors and so on. You're trying to govern that relationship using the Factories Act of 1857 or in 1900s, whatever, right? It doesn't apply, of course, but now you have to either force fit them or completely leave them out. Which one do you do? So instead, you rationalize and modernize some of these labor laws. You can go far.
That's great. So there's a question from Sanjana who's asking, can job creation go hand in hand with increasing minimum wages?
Oh, this is a tough one. I had written a piece on this for Mint called on minimum wages. That I think minimum wages is a problematic thing. It's one of those again policies which sounds lovely in theory, that having minimum wage is one of those basic decency factor. But I think the problem is that governments never get fixing the minimum wages correctly. They always try to be ambitious, but even if you fix if the going market rate is 80 rupees, you fix it at 82 rupees even, then you're already creating distortions in the market. If a guy doesn't want to, if a person doesn't want to hire people at 82 rupees, he would rather not hire and not do that economic activity than be forced to pay a minimum wage far higher. So I think minimum wages are tricky. There's been enough kind of economic evidence from across the world regarding minimum wages and employment. For example, in Canada didn't have minimum wages for a long time, and US did. And Canada changed that at one point of time and introduced minimum wages. The year it did that, you suddenly saw a spike in unemployment. So minimum wages creates unemployment, right? But I think it's also, at one point, it's a humanitarian thing. It goes just beyond plain, econ 101. It is a humanitarian thing. So I think society has to kind of make these really difficult trade-offs as to what it prefers. Are you willing to, for example, ensure that everyone who works gets a basic decent salary, but it might come at the cost that 10 of your neighbors are unemployed? Are you willing to do that? Right? That's, I think, a question uniquely posed for society. Economics is very clear on this. Minimum wages creates unemployment. That's fairly well known, but are you willing to make that trade-off is, I think, a question that society has to answer.
So you're copying, not answering the question.
No, I have my preferences, but those would be opinions. It's not
Okay.
something that I can impose on others.
Valid. So Sneha is asking, what would the ideal social safety net look like?
I think for a lot of these things, we might be getting distracted by looking at social safety nets. According to me, social safety net is a second order problem. The first order problem is just ensuring that people have jobs to begin with, and then you can look at how do you ensure those jobs are good, or how do you ensure those jobs are pays well, how do you ensure that there are good working conditions, and so on. But even then, I would say, go back to that initial matrix that we were talking about, that 2 by 2. If you can, for example, ensure that there is not too high volatility in income over a person's livelihood. So even people who work in the organized sector, unorganized sector, gig economy, etc., if you can help in smoothing out the income levels, and there are policy tools which are available to do that, I think that is the kind of social safety net that we should be looking at. So whatever they earn, help them smoothen it out over a long period of time, which means part of it is just access to credit, by the way. Part of it is pension schemes and so on, where government can give an equal defined contribution, employees can give that contribution, and so on.
Are you looking at direct cash transfers or something?
You can look at direct, you can UBI. The problem is, all of these ideas are great, but reality tells us that India cannot afford any of these things. So the only way that we can start looking at social safety nets is when we get to that position where we can actually deploy them and make it implementable. And we are slightly far away from that. So the point is, if you try to go and employ policies which, for example, work very well in Norway at India's level of income, you're only going to create disasters and destroy value instead of adding to it. So we've got to be very careful on that front. There are some things which, as I said, are humanitarian in nature and can be done and should be done, but a lot of other safety nets, I think, will distract us from the true goal, which is grow fast, get people employed, get jobs, give them income, and then once the pie grows larger, then you can think about all of these things about distributing it better.
This reminds me of what Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah talked about in their recent book, where they were talking about growth as being a really important part in the science of policy making.
Yeah, exactly. The only way to ensure that, if you want to create safety nets, the only way you can get there is by having enough money to create those safety nets. The only way you have enough money to create those safety nets is by growing, and you can grow by not hampering them by introducing safety nets too early. That's the problematic vicious kind of circle, but you got to be aware of it.
So Ayushi is asking a question: how many years will it take for India to recover from this critical unemployment crisis?
Depends. I think the really sad, depressing answer in all of this is, it may never. We don't know. Depends on how you play your cards, right? Because if you see the way that the world is going, and we're talking about jobs crisis, and I've not mentioned, automation at all, which is going to play a very big role. AI is this thing, but I mean, I would say automation is still about, good 5 or 6 years away from India. I mean, that we have to worry about it as a policy challenge, but it's going to come at some point, 6 years, 10 years, I don't know, but it's going to come, right? And within that time, if we don't fix some of these things, it might be, forget about a lost generation. Because if you look at what happened in the Japanese economy in the 90s, they had brilliant growth until the 90s, and then they tapered off. They had this, what you would call a secular stagnation, and then just an outright kind of, just blah growth, 0%, 1% growth rate, not creating enough jobs, people are getting old. I think we are at that cusp. If we don't fix things now, you're going to have not just a lost generation, but lost generations, multiple of them, multiple generations without jobs. And of course, we don't even have the level of income that Japan has, so that you can redistribute them cleverly. We don't have that income. And I think that is a surefire way to get, as I said, this is going to be bleak, right? That's a surefire way to create complete social disorder and anarchy. Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, there's not really good news. So I think, instead of trying to hide the data and trying to wish away the problem, you got to take cognizance of it, and you got to, I think, actively start doing something about it now.
So you talked about, there's a question on labor force participation rate. Right. So the India's labor force participation rate is 48%.
Right.
How does that compare with other countries?
I think it's rather poor. In fact, I think the standard, or by and large average kind of labor force participation rate for a country of our size should be around 60 to 70%. China 70%, US is 62, UK is 64, Japan is actually a lot lesser because they're older. But that is the range that we're talking about, an acceptable range for a country. But if for an emerging, growing, fast-growing country, it should actually be far higher. Bangladesh, for example, has got wonderful labor force participation rate in the high 60s or 70s. Right, so that I think
and they're growing at 8-9% right now.
So I mean, we're at a situation where we truly should be envious of Bangladesh.
Yes, because their per capita GDP is going to cross us if it hasn't already crossed us.
Yeah.
So Bangladesh is going to be a richer country than India if it already not right now.
So so in that sense, at least this thing. So I think when you look at just the unemployment number, when you say it's about 8%, and it doesn't seem too big a deal, because again, US unemployment numbers is 4-5%. There are many countries, advanced countries, which have 8% unemployment rate. Sorry, and so that I think is masking the problem, because the true problem is with our labor force participation rate. So if you had, let's say, 70% labor force participation rate, your unemployment rate would be as high as 20 to 25%. Right? That I think is a worrisome trend, which people do not speak about.
Yeah, because then you'll obviously have far more people to get jobs to.
Exactly.
So we've actually done quite well in this ease of doing business rankings, but at the same time, we've jumped up the rankings, but our job creation has gone down. So how do you kind of reconcile these two? We were like 142 on the labor force ranking, and on the ease of doing business, we're now 63.
The ease of doing business, and sorry if it hurts anyone's this thing, but it's a massive scam, right? It's a game. It can be, it's a number which can be gamed very easily, and we've done that well. We're not the only country which has done well. For example, Russia has jumped up massively in terms of ease of doing business. But you actually ask a businessman whether they would want to do business in Russia, the answer would be no. Similarly, the ease of doing business the only way that that ease of doing business is actually getting better is if investment flows through, and that is not happening. As I said, investment has been falling continuously, right? Which means that all of this is a game. They've gamed it well. I can show you, it's basically saying, Yazad, I'll call you a good boy if you do A, B, and C.
And you do ABC.
And you will do A, B, and C, but then you will screw up extremely badly on D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right? And that's exactly what India's been doing. We've gamed it perfectly, but I don't think it really counts for much.
So this is a good time to ask you for your concluding thoughts. What do you think on, what should we do? And
okay, so if I should just kind of sum up a lot of these things, I would first say transparency. It's a no-brainer. First, take cognizance of the problem, acknowledge the problem, talk about it, release data, and be open about it. That's the only way you're going to solve the problem, by first acknowledging it. Do not say pakoda walas, we are creating jobs through pakodas. It's not a job, right? It falls very low on the both income and stability scale. So that's point number one. Second thing, I think big ticket items would be, just as I said, get out of a lot of things that you're currently doing. Get out of the way, help make it truly easy for businesses to function. So reform labor laws, land laws, etc. Fix the banking system. That suppose that's what you've messed it up by having such large NPAs. I think you have to fix that. You can do corporatization of some of the boards of these banks. You can in fact even bring in better corporate audit, so that you deal with corporate balance sheets as well. So that's all one big bucket of problems that you can try and solve, which I think they should. Then it's about getting infrastructure correctly. Our infrastructure is kind of really terrible, and all of this adds up to that investment thing, right? How do you get investment up? One, making sure there's access to credit. So for example, one of the things that we've been speaking about for a long time but have not done anything about it is have a corporate bond market, right?
Yeah, we don't have a corporate bond market.
We don't. The market is so small and puny that I think India is one of the few countries where the equity market is about 4 times larger, or even more, if I'm not mistaken, than the bond market.
And most other countries have a larger bond market.
Huge bond market than an equity market. So that's an obvious failing. So which means that this all ties in together, right? And because companies or corporates cannot raise money through the bond market, they have to go to banks. And so basically what they're doing is they are getting long-term loans from banks, but banks are getting short-term deposits, and therefore you have this asset mismatch, right? Asset liability mismatch, and that is what leads to this entire crisis of confidence in the financial sector, and there you have a banking crisis, right? And then we make things worse. You have NBFCs which borrow even short term and try to lend long term. You have this entire NBFC crisis going on, and therefore now no one wants to touch any of these things. No one wants to borrow. No one wants to invest. And if you don't invest, again, you can't create jobs. So I think solving the financial crisis is one big aspect of it, and then a lot of other things in terms of how do you you can call it ease of doing business, you can call it anything else, but it's that private investment mood, right? How do you increase that? If, for example, I'm a manufacturer of a medical device, and then out of the blue the government will come and say, sorry, you cannot price stents more than 29,000, even though it might cost you 1 lakh to produce it. How will those companies survive? We do multiple such things. We put price caps everywhere. We suddenly ban stuff. We banned of all the things, e-cigarettes. We put price caps on schools. We put price caps on something else. We go ahead and ban something else. So it's this overly interfering kind of mabab sarkar, whatever you call that, right? I mean, this overly interfering, annoying government which exists, which keeps coming in the way of people doing business. Pharmaceutical, I mean, this thing, we have a national list of essential medicines which goes on for which has 800 drugs or so included in it, and you expect the pharma sector to create jobs. How can they create jobs, right? So a whole host of these problems. I think the important thing is to just get out of the way, let businesses function, ease labor laws, ease land laws. You have to do that. That's a no-brainer, really. And then few of the other things that you can do is create good infrastructure, create cities, help cities develop, and that's, I think, broadly what can be done on this. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of things.
No, but that itself is a very good policy list if we have hopefully the right people listening.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you.
The first order of business, putting the